In 1964, the citizens of a Northern California town would experience a series of unexplained events that would leave the majority of its people dead. But what happened and why? That's what I'll be exploring in the case of the mysterious births of Midwich. Now, if you've never heard of the mysterious births of Midwich, I completely understand why. Typically, the demographic who's aware of this is older, so if you were born after 2000, you may or may not be aware of it. But I'm going to clarify all of that tonight, so let's go ahead and get into it. So like I mentioned, our story starts back in 1964 in the northern coastal California town of Midwich. And by all accounts, this is a pretty close community where everyone knows everyone and people generally get along pretty well. So on the day in question, there was a giant party, kind of like a barbecue get-together kind of thing where the community comes out, they bring food, and everybody just has a good time. They kick back and enjoy themselves. But that's when things start to get weird because that's all anybody remembers from that day. In fact, the only reason we have an account of what occurred that day is because those passing by the city, and luckily not through, reported their findings to the police. They stated in certain calls that it looked like there was a massacre. Bodies everywhere, even the livestock were sleeping. And that triggered the authorities to come out and investigate for themselves. And along with them came the EPA, CIA, FBI, and do their own concurrent investigations. And of course, there was a lot of finger pointing involved, with the EPA pointing at the FBI and CIA, the CIA saying it was a stunt by the EPA, and generally just accusations going everywhere. But there was some pretty reasonable possibilities. You see, there was an army base and an air force base nearby, so they thought it could be chemical testing that knocked out most of the populace. But for the results from each one of the agencies that was on site during that event said the same exact thing: inconclusive, meaning that there was no explanation for what occurred in Midwich that day. And sadly, there were a number of deaths they had to account for as well, because people fell asleep doing some very dangerous activities. But for those who lived to tell the tale, they woke up with a couple of bumps and bruises and maybe some heartache. But ultimately, the event appeared to be very traumatic for the citizens, as nobody could tell what happened. There is one unique account from a woman who was inside of the knockout line before the event began, and she recalls being in her classroom and looking at the clock on the wall. She found it odd that the clock said 10 p.m., especially because the barbecue that they were at didn't start until 2 p.m., and at latest it couldn't have been past 3 p.m. And so while she found that odd, she didn't think much about it, but she also recalled hearing a canary and then nothing at all. She didn't remember anything until she woke up hours later and it was actually 7 or 8 o'clock p.m. She could not explain the time difference or if there was a time difference at all. Now, of course, I said this story is a strange one because when the CIA gets involved in a small town, you should always be suspect. Now, once this event started to happen, it started to pique the interest of several different agencies, but the CIA and the National Health Institute, I think, took place in Midwich just to monitor the people there to make sure everything was okay. But during their tenure, they noticed there were a number of women who were pregnant at the same time. Now, while that in and of itself is not unique, it is unique when one of them is a virgin, truly had never had sex before or even had a boyfriend, and two, there was another woman whose husband had been gone for a year with 6 months on the clock left, and so there was no way she could have gotten pregnant, and she wasn't cheating either. So how did this happen? Now, this is where things take a weird left turn. Enter Dr. Susan Werner, an epidemiologist. She corrals all of these pregnant women and she offers to make them a deal. In exchange for letting her monitor the babies during their development and into their childhood, she will pay for all of their prenatal care, postnatal care, and give them a stipend of $3,000 a month. And in the event they have 2 children, they'll get $3,000 for every child they have. So that's pretty substantial. But in the event they decide to alleviate their pregnancies, which is at their discretion, they would just be excluded from the trials and they wouldn't get the $3,000 stipend. But this convinces most of the women to keep their child because they decide that that is a pretty lucrative deal and that now having a child is not cost prohibitive, especially because $3,000 a month in the 60s is quite substantial. So this makes a rather confusing, maybe traumatic and sad situation a bit more cheerful for these women who were considering this option for themselves. And most of them are inspired to keep the kid, and they allow Dr. Werner to conduct their testing on these children as they grow. So to add another level of weird to this, all of the women go into labor on the exact same night. 10 women in the hospital giving birth at the exact same time. Now, of the 10 who went in, 9 successfully delivered, but for one of them, her daughter was born stillborn. Sadly, there was nothing they could do to save the baby, so out of the 10 that there were, 9 survived. 5 girls, 4 boys, in a really peculiar set of events. Everything was pretty okay. In fact, as the children developed and got a little older, most would describe them as really cute and really charming, but there was something really off-putting about them as well. Despite all of them having different parents with different phenotypes, the children ended up looking the exact same. Very pale skin, very bright eyes, of various colors, but still the same very bright eyes, and very pale hair. Think of any Targaryen that you like, and that's what those kids look like, except many versions of them. Cute as can be, but a little ominous, especially because when they were together, they would order themselves in a way that was uncharacteristic of babies and or toddlers, and that started to become a problem for people. Not only this, as people spent more time around the children, stranger things would start to happen. It was said that if you upset the children, hurt them in any way, or they just didn't like you, that you might find yourself in harm's way. There were many who found themselves in the children's crosshairs and didn't live to tell the tale. They would be found the next day dead under mysterious circumstances. There were never any physical injuries. In fact, most of them were dead from self-inflicted wounds. So what happened to these people? Even stranger, it said that as the children got older, they alienated themselves, appeared to organize themselves, and had a hierarchy that they stuck to regardless of what was going on. In fact, they were so dedicated to it that most of them could be seen walking in 2 straight lines, one of 5 and one of 4, with one missing spot for the child who had died in birth. But the strangest thing about this case is that this is not the only instance where there are children like this. In fact, they've been found all over the globe, except those communities have been blown off the map. But I don't know what happened to the kids of Midwich. The mystery for them is still unexplained. Anyways, let me know your thoughts on that.